Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in the Harvard Classic Lectures. This is lecture number 107 from Thoreau's Walden, chapter number 8, The Village. Now our assumptions here that you've been following our stuff on learnstrong.net, lectures 99 through 106 in the Harvard Classics folder, and then as well our comments in the junior folder, especially as it relates to something like civil disobedience, which you'll see that we've given several comments on civil disobedience. It's going to be referenced actually in this very brief chapter. This is one of the shortest of the chapters of the prose poem, as I will refer to it in Walden and have in earlier texts. Also, we're assuming that you're conversant with our three levels of reading, understanding, and our annotative process. At level 1, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? At 2A, themes and messages. And then, of course, at 2B, rhetoric. Not what's said, but how it is said. And then finally, at level 3, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At level 3A, how does it relate to other texts, other titles, as well as, of course, the referencing to other passages from Walden himself. And then finally, and most importantly, how can I relate to this information personally, so that you can, from each one of these chapters, I hope, derive at least one idea that moves you in some way, challenges you in some way. Also, the assumption is that you're familiar with what we call in 303 our Big Five. What does this text say about epistemology, what one can know, ontology, who one is, the study of being, psychology, motivations of the individual psyche, sociology, understandings of the group. That'll be obviously significant given this text is called The Village. And then finally, theodicy, the question of theodicy. What does it mean to have pain and suffering in the world, and how do we somehow relate to it? Now here again, as we have said before, we see this movement, this pendulum-like movement between the books in pairs, so that, for example, we'll see the dualisms that are evidence, or the tension of those dualisms, as it relates to chapter 7 of the Beanfield, which we've just spoken of, and then finally the village here. That is to say, that movement between psychology and sociology is another way to say it. Now let's turn to chapter 8. We'll do as we've done in previous conversations. We'll summarize real quickly, and then we'll get into the actual reading of the text itself. We're going to begin the village by an observation by Thoreau, that he visits town every, day or two to catch up on the news, he says, to observe. In other words, in the same way that he likes to observe owls in the woods, he likes to observe villagers in their quote-unquote habitat, right? As, he loves to look at squirrels, and he loves to look at humans in the same way. Those of us who love, for example, to sit in malls, airports, bus stations, whatever, and people study, we're going to love this chapter called The Village, right? But he does make some observations that are somewhat critical of the town. Obviously, he went to the woods to live deliberately, he says in chapter 2, which seems to suggest that he wasn't living deliberately before. That is to say, he was living in the town before, and maybe in the town you can't live as deliberately as one would live, fronting only the essential facts of the woods or of nature as he comments on it. So he'll comment on the idle curiosity, the materialism, right, which in many ways removes the possibility of independent living and, of course, the simplicity of one's life. The town makes things more complicated, he's going to say. He does try to stay away from much of the shops on Concord's Mill Dam. He will try to make his quick escape from many of the houses that he reckons are kind of beckoning to him, the way that maybe the sirens will tempt Odysseus and his men in, of course, the classic, the Odyssey. In many ways, we have said that the Iliad is such an influential text, but honestly, guys, in many ways, I would say the Odyssey sits behind a whole lot of our reading of this text, as obviously does the Aeneid. That is to say, going on an adventure and having all of these challenges along the way. He does write about sometimes going back to the pond and to his hut in the evening. And he talks a little bit about the value of being lost. It's quite a beautiful passage about being lost in the dark or in a snowstorm. It's when we're lost that we begin to really understand the value of the way. It almost sounds like he's familiar, and he probably was, right, with Shakespeare's Sonnet 116, when Shakespeare talks about love as being the star to every wandering bark whose worth's unknown although his height be taken. We really don't understand the power of the North Star until we're out in the middle of the ocean in a storm, and then we look up and we see the star and we know how to navigate. He does offer as well a different perspective in terms of finding ourselves, because he says that a person who is lost is disoriented and then begins to really appreciate nature all over again. It is this being lost that we quote-unquote find ourselves and realize what we are, as well as the infinite extent of our relations. We'll get to those lines. It's quite a lovely passage. Finally, he will mention his jailing. Okay, so he goes into Concord in 1846, and he was asked by actually a friend of his about paying the poll tax, and he said that he refused to do it because he was protesting slavery and the Mexican War, and he in the end comments on the intrusion of these kinds of institutions upon men's lives. This, of course, will lead to the famous civil disobedience, which we've given full comments and lectures on as well. Let's take a look now at this passage. Again, as we said, it's a very brief passage, but let's enjoy it nonetheless, all right? He will say it this way: after hoeing, or perhaps reading and writing in the forenoon, I usually bathed again in the pond, swimming across one of its coves for a stint, and washed the dust of labor from my person, or soothed out the last wrinkle which study had made, and for the afternoon was absolutely free. And this has been a text about freedom, multiple different types of freedom, no doubt. Every day or two, he says, I strolled to the village to hear some of the gossip, which is incessantly going on there, circulating either from mouth to mouth or from newspaper to newspaper, in which, taken in homeopathic doses, was really as refreshing in its way as the rustle of leaves and the peeping of frogs. In other words, nature of a different kind, we might say. And as I walked in the woods to see the birds and squirrels, so I walked in the village to see the men and boys. Instead of the wind among the pines, I heard the carts rattle. In one direction from my house, there was a colony of muskrats in the river meadows. Under the grove of elms and buttonwoods in the other horizon was a village of busy men, as curious to me as if they'd been prairie dogs, each sitting at the mouth of its burrow or running over to a neighbor's to gossip. I went there frequently to observe their habits. The village appeared to me a great newsroom. Now, this idea of being an observer, I think this is important for our reading of Walden, to recognize that he's always challenging us to be observing, to be watching, to be listening, to be paying attention. That is to say, mindfulness, right? And this will be language that he learned from his study of the Buddha as well. He says a few lines later, I observed that the vitals of the village were the grocery, the barroom, the post office, and the bank. And as necessary part of the machinery, they kept a bell, a big gun, a fire engine in convenient places, and the houses were so arranged as to make the most of mankind in lanes and fronting one another, so that every traveler had to run the gauntlet, and every man, woman, and child might get a lick at him. Now this is of course funny, because earlier he commented in Beans, in the bean farm, about how he loved so much the roads. And if you'll think about it, and you see this of course if you ever fly over a town or a city, you'll notice the way that it's laid out will remind you of some kind of a field of agriculture, and he'll make some of those same kinds of connections. He continues, I escaped wonderfully from these dangers. He's talking about walking through the town and that kind of thing. For the most part, I escaped wonderfully from these dangers, either by proceeding at once boldly and without deliberation to the goal. It's funny that he would say without deliberation, because he wishes to live deliberately when he's in the woods, right? As it is recommended to those who run the gauntlet, or by keeping my thoughts on high things like Orpheus. And the fact that he mentions Orpheus here makes us all go, oh yes, the great singer, the classic singer, Orpheus. This Orpheus has been standing behind all of the words to this point, who, quote, loudly singing the praises of the gods to his lyre, drowned the voices of the sirens and kept out of danger, and quote, sometimes, he says, I bolted suddenly, and nobody could tell my whereabouts, for I did not stand much upon gracefulness, and never hesitated at a gap in a fence. I was even accustomed to make an irritation into some houses, an eruption into some houses where I was well entertained. And after learning the kernels and very last sipfuls of news, what had subsided, the prospects of war and peace, and whether the world was likely to hold together much longer, Ironic, given, of course, that we have the American Civil War coming. So much of what we'll read about in Walden is precedent to the horrors in American history, right? I was led out through the rear avenues and so escaped to the woods again. He'll say it this way: I was never cast away nor distressed in any weather. He's talking now about walking home. Any weather, though I encountered some severe storms. He says, it's darker in the woods, even in common nights, than most suppose. I frequently had to look up at the opening between the trees above the path in order to learn my route, and where there was no cart path, to feel with my feet the faint track which I had worn, or steer by the known relation of particular trees which I felt with my hands, passing between two pines, for instance, not more than 18 inches apart in the midst of the woods, invariably in the darkest night. I had a student who got lost hunting one late October, and then the storm arrived, and he reported later that there was a certain kind of real fear about how one moves through the woods. And then he commented that he remembered in the passage of The Village that Thoreau made a similar kind of observation about how you can feel your way if you know it well enough. And obviously we can read these lines as metaphor. In some ways, isn't it true? This is what all of us do for our entire life, right? We're always kind of feeling our way along. We try to be as confident as we can be, but the reality is we're always working with woods and trees 18 inches apart. He says, sometimes, after coming home thus late in a dark and muggy night, when my feet felt the path which my eyes could not see, dreaming and absent-minded all the way, until I was aroused by having to raise my hand to lift the latch, I have not been able to recall a single step of my walk. We've had this experience, of course, when we're driving sometimes. We know we drove the distance, but we can't remember anything about it, right? We're almost in that Zen-like mindset, and he's here, right? And I thought that perhaps my body would find its way if its master should forsake it, as the hand finds its way to the mouth without assistance. And of course here references are obvious to Plato's Phaedo and the idea that Socrates says that his soul will know its way to go once it's released from its body. Several times, he says, when a visitor chanced to stay into evening and it proved a dark night, I was obliged to conduct him to the cart path in the rear of the house and then point out to him the direction he was to pursue, and in keeping which he was to be guided rather by his feet than his eyes. And then he says, one very dark night, I directed thus on my way 2 young men who had been fishing in the pond. And then he tells about how they had to find their way back. He says, by night, of course, a few lines later, the perplexity is infinitely greater. And the beautiful poetry that comes, someone said this is some of the most beautiful poetry in all of the poem, Walden. Again, I call it a prose poem. By night, of course, the perplexity is infinitely greater. In our most trivial walks, we are constantly, though unconsciously, steering like pilots by certain well-known beacons and headlands. You think of T.S. Eliot's Dry Salvages here, as well as obviously Whitman's O Captain, My Captain. And if we go beyond our usual course, we still carry in our minds the bearing of some neighboring cape. And not till we are completely lost or turned around, for a man needs only to be turned around once with his eyes shut in this world to be lost, do we appreciate the vastness and strangeness of nature. Of course, Jordan Peterson makes this observation very well when he says, everything is order until it becomes chaos. That is to say, you don't really think of your car as a car, you just think of it as a tool until, of course, it makes a funny sound in the middle of the Badlands at 1 in the morning, and then all of a sudden it dies. And then all of a sudden it becomes this strange object. That is to say, we're always moving from order to chaos, and then from chaos back to order again. That's the beautiful, beautiful dance that Thoreau is referencing here. Every man, he says, has to learn the points of compass again, as often as he awakes, whether from sleep or any abstraction. In other words, we're always rooting. We're always rooting ourselves back into the earth again. We're always trying to find our compass, find our true north, find our way. Life is a process of these passages, no question, of special significance, where we're trying to figure out how we're going to make it, these rites of passage as they're sometimes referenced. He says, not till we are lost, in other words, not till we have lost the world, do we begin to find ourselves and realize where we are and the infinite extent of our relations. That is to say, he that wishes to save his life shall lose it, Christ is purported to have said. Just to finish with this idea now, it's interesting that he moves from this idea about being lost and then found into the story that will lead, of course, to civil disobedience, the essay, right? And, of course, that essay has tremendous influence. I mean, influencing Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and, of course, any number of other would-be protesters, would-be challengers to the system. I find it interesting that we're going to hear this, and I'm going to read this because it's so powerful. But I'm interested that he's just finished with this notion of you're never really found until you're lost, and then he'll say it. One afternoon, near the end of the first summer, when I went to the village to get a shoe from the cobbler's, I was seized and put into jail. It's interesting he would use the word seized, and put into jail. And of course we cannot help but think about, obviously, Socrates and being put into jail, and of course Plato's famous final plays, final dialogues to tell us about all of this, the Euthyphro, the Apology, Cato, and then finally we mentioned already the Phaedo. Put into jail because, as I have elsewhere related, obviously the civil disobedience, I did not pay a tax to or recognize the authority of the state, which buys and sells men, women, and children like cattle at the door of its Senate house. I had gone down to the woods for other purposes, but whether a man goes, men will pursue and paw him with their dirty institutions, and if they can, constrain him to belong to their desperate odd fellow society. At no point in Walden does Thoreau become more clearly abolitionist and more challenging to the institutions of authority that he considers to be here dirty institutions, dirty by virtue of the fact that they will participate in illegal activities, slavery, and of course the Mexican War. It is true, I might have resisted forcibly with more or less effect, but have run amok against society. We think of the opening lines of Republic, in Republic 1, when Polemarchus will say to Socrates, how can we hear if we refuse to listen? See how many of us there are. Clearly Thoreau is playing around with some of that information. But he says, I preferred that society should run amok against me, it being the desperate party. However, he says, I was released the next day, obtained my mended shoe, and returned to the woods in season to get my dinner of huckleberries on Fairhaven Hill. I was never molested by any person but those who represented the state. Now this is fascinating to read, right? He says, really, if you stand up, and in Emerson's language, of course, self-reliance, if you stand up, you will almost inevitably find yourself standing against the state for any number of reasons. This sounds so much like Socrates in Apology, doesn't it? Where, of course, he said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And then to finish, I had no lock nor bolt, but the desk which held my papers, not even a nail to put over my latch or windows. I never fastened my door, night or day, though I was to be absent several days. Not even when the next fall I spent a fortnight in the woods of Maine. He says, I never felt like I needed to lock my house when I was living out in the woods. And yet, he says, my house was more respected than if it had been surrounded by a file of soldiers. The tired rambler could rest and warm himself by my fire. The literary amuse himself with a few books on my table, or the curious by opening my closet door, see what was left of my dinner and what prospect I had of a supper. Yet, though many people of every class came this way to the pond, I suffered no serious inconvenience from these sources, and I never missed anything but one small book, a volume of Homer, which perhaps was improperly gilded, and this, I trust, a soldier of our camp has found by this time. I am convinced, he says, this sounding very much like Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching, I'm convinced that if all men were to live as simply as I then did, thieving and robbery would be unknown. These take place, he says, only in communities where some have got more than is sufficient, while others have not enough. And of course, this is that great debate, right? We hear of it in our study of Marx. We hear of it elsewhere, right? That is to say, when one begins to amass large amounts of commodities, inevitably there will be friction. He finishes by pointing out, love, he says it this way, you who govern public affairs, what need have you to employ punishments? Love virtue, and the people will be virtuous, literally quoting from the Tao Te Ching. The virtues of a superior man are like the wind. The virtues of a common man are like the grass. The grass, when the wind passes over it, bends. Well, this is, of course, the beauty of Thoreau. He will take some simple observation like getting lost on your way home, to your hut in the woods, to then talk specifically about a time that he got lost and he got found. That is to say, he got seized and he got released. Well, from here, we move now to chapter 9 and the ponds, for some people, their favorite of all of the chapters of Walden. I hope that you're being challenged by Thoreau. Thank you.